Um, this is a small research project I did, I'm ashamed to say, over a year ago, and I haven't done anything with it since. And this seemed like a really good opportunity to kind of kickstart that again for me. Um, it it kind of follows on from what John's talking about, but it's got a different angle. What I'm interested in here is the fact that we do like and not like um, students and maybe ourselves a bit working with them. The kind of person, the hidden self is the things that we subsume, and the ideal self is what we strive for in our work. This is my idea anyway. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking you through the project, what I did, what I found out, and then I've got some uh, questions towards the end. I realise we'll do what we can with discussion on the chat. I think from what I've seen on John's presentation, I don't think that's going to be an issue at all. I've got some questions I'd be really interested in, particularly as we've got uh, different international models going on here. All right, so what am I talking about? Emotion at work. Emotion at work is really important because I realised, and maybe it sounds obvious, but I realised one day that the kind of day that I'd had, did I go home and say, oh, or did I go home with a bit of a buzz? It depended to a large extent on the experience I had with different students and my own response to them, as in my emotional response. So this gave rise to the aims of the study because, I mean, maybe this is just me. I don't think it is. There are some students I work with. I enjoy spending time with them. Um, it's a fun bit of time. We get work done. It's productive. Um, there are some students for whom this simply is not true. Um, and I would be very happy not to see them again if that was my choice. But it's not my choice, and I'm not going to behave in an unpleasant way towards them. Um, I've I've got a job to do, and I want to do it as well as possible, which means being pleasant and friendly and accessible to the students. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about these conflicted emotions and how they can be managed in the context of a job. Um, my my library, I'm based in library at Solent University, and a few years ago we very proudly achieved Customer Service Excellence, a government sponsored award for customer service. Um, Now this means that the student is our customer and their needs are paramount. So in this kind of environment, what kind of effect does it have on those of us working in student-facing roles? Um, Marx called it an instrument of labour. Are we an instrument of labour in this role? And what does it feel like to be a tutor in that environment? And how do we deal with that, not just as individuals, but maybe even as a profession, as far as we can generalise? This is what started it all off. A friend of mine recommended I read this book. She thought it was brilliant, and she was right. So thank you, Jeanette. This was published originally in 1982, and Arlie Russell Hochschild, apologies if I've pronounced that wrong, it wanted to understand emotional labour of American flight attendants, and her work was done back in the 1970s when flight attendants were weighed every month, and if they put on weight 3 months in a row, they were suspended until they'd lost the weight again. So, we've moved on, but have we moved on that much? We live in a modern capitalist society, and in that kind of society, the employee is there to reflect the organisation. We are representatives of our workplaces, and we have to reflect the what do you call it? The disposition, I suppose, of our organisation. So we've got a particular attitude that we have, particular viewpoint, and a particular way of feeling that, to an extent, is mandated by the organisation. And I think this is true now for modern universities, certainly in the UK. I don't want to make any assumptions about elsewhere in the world, but certainly in the UK, I would say we come into this framework. And it generates a conflict because you want to deliver a service well, but under this kind of framework, you're estranged from your own feelings. You have to instead feel what the organization requires you to feel. And therefore, those feelings become part of the offering, they're part of the job. Doing the job well requires expressing certain emotions. Appearing to love the job becomes part of the job. And when you're working with people in a service environment, then you know that you've done your job well because you're generating a particular state of mind. Um, so I read this book. I do recommend it. It was there's a 20th anniversary edition. She's updated it a little bit. Um, so I read this and I thought, right, I want to dig into this. I think we need a nice big questionnaire. Um, oh, look at that. Sorry, I'm not reading my slides properly. Yeah, let's read that. So you're trying to either induce a feeling in somebody else or suppress a feeling in yourself to sustain um, your visible features that make other people feel a certain way. So what's going on with learning developers? I developed a questionnaire. I sent it out to the LDHE and GISMAIL list. There might even be a few people on here who answered it, I don't know. It was all anonymous, and there were 21 purely qualitative questions. Some people put a lot of effort into that, which was wonderful. Got some really long answers, so I'm very grateful to that. And what I wanted to know was their notions of the ideal. What did they see the ideal student as being like? What was the ideal tutor like? What was the ideal working day? What kind of emotions might they feel in the typical day? And good or bad as well. What kind of situations might give rise to those emotions? You can see that this, this took a little bit of time for people to answer. I especially wanted to know what it was like to work for a tutor to work with a student that they didn't like. How supported they felt in their work by whoever, work, family, colleagues, how important that support was. I thought it'd be interesting to know how much control people had over their day, because I'm fairly autonomous. I mean, I have to go to meetings occasionally, but outside of that, I can organise my time, and when I see students, pretty much how I choose to. But not everybody can do that. So how important is that? The question of students being passive. What if students just aren't engaged? How do you deal with that? And then two challenging questions just to finish off. How far did they identify with their job role, however they chose to interpret that? And what did they think it meant to be authentic in their role, however they chose to interpret that? So I wanted to understand that nice quote at the bottom from Hochschild. Emotion signals the me I put into seeing you. So in our one-to-ones or even in a class situation with students, what emotions are creating the me that is presented to that audience? Right, so I got all of this lovely qualitative data back, and I started off by trying to make some notes. That wasn't going to work, so I made a nice grid instead, and that was much more satisfying. I like filling in boxes. So I reduced all of the qualitative data down to themes. I pulled bits in here and there, keywords, phrases, where I felt they reflected these kind of themes. One for each respondent, and then I could identify any patterns and compare answers, maybe merge some of these together, and it was fun. I'm not gonna lie, it was fun to do that. I would do it again. And this is the important bit. What did I get out of that? So first of all, what kind of person is a tutor? If we were to imagine like a person spec for a job, this is the kind of thing that tutors say tutors should be like. This is both implicit and explicit as well. What traits are most desirable in a tutor? These are all derived from the kinds of things that respondents said a tutor should do, such as be a person to whom students can let off steam, for example. So you can see these kind of words are not neutral. They invoke an expectation of a particular kind of response from a tutor. And again, this is not from students, this is tutor viewpoint of themselves. Regardless of how a tutor might be feeling, because we are human, come into work feeling how you feel, and yet you are, to be a good tutor, expected or expecting yourself to convey these emotions to your students. Uh, who feels like this all the time, every day, regardless of whatever's going on? That is a rhetorical question because the answer is no one. No one feels like this naturally all the time. It takes effort. And this is exactly what Hochschild was talking about when she talked about emotional labour. Being caring, being calm and sympathetic, having a can-do attitude. It takes energy. It takes sometimes a deliberate choice to be those things. I was kind of interested in what students would say as well. I didn't want to get too sidetracked by that at that stage, but I happened to have a few on hand, and I sent out a small questionnaire anonymously, and they said things very similar. They wanted their tutors to be passionate and smiley and kind. They also wanted to be able to contact their tutors absolutely anytime they wanted. Um, I think that is I think that's horrific. We're not going to go into that. And Mandy, absolutely, that is why you're so tired at the end of the day. I want to know if the students are that tired. I bet they're not. But that's another discussion, isn't it? All right, so this is our person spec. What about the job description? What do tutors actually do? Here's another little picture. This is what tutors do. These are all verbs that came up in various places around the responses. And Wendy, yes, I've had students very disappointed that I wasn't in at Christmas because they were free. Sunday evenings, oh, I'm sorry for emailing you. I'm not reading my email. It's fine. You go ahead. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So verbs. There's a lot of verbs going on here, a lot of very busy verbs. And the thing that stood out for me is that these are all one way. And again, this is tutors saying what tutors do. Tutors are doing very active things here. Um, they are devising, they are offering, they're inspiring. Tutors are really busy. So this is why you sleep so well. It's all one way, but how do we know it's worth it? Because the student appears to be happy and contented. Or at the very least, they're engaged. And this is our payoff, and this is the sign of good service and what we're aiming for. Right. Now, with flight attendants, a proper way to experience the customer is understood by everybody as part of the job. So you're not supposed to appear to feel that way. You're supposed to feel that way, at least in the 1970s and early 80s. So how do we experience what we like in students and when we're working with students? Because what I don't want to do is just be very negative and point out how everything is awful, because we're all here doing this job, I think, because we want to be. So it's important to look at what we get out of it, and we get a lot of positive feeling out of it. Encounters are generally characterized by positive feelings and a sense of reward both for the tutor and the student. So comparing these tables above, and I appreciate the arrows might be misleading because they weren't necessarily mentioned in conjunction with each other, but they do line up rather satisfyingly, so I put some arrows in. There's a lot of mutuality going on in a successful teaching situation. So if your student appears to be curious, then that's a challenge for you, because you want to rise to that, and you want feed that curiosity, and that's a positive thing. If the student is willing to participate, then you can build up a rapport with them. If they're willing to learn, you're willing to teach. If they appear confident, then that might be very empowering for you. And these are all words that appeared on my responses that I haven't rephrased anything. Students can show gratitude, which is really, really lovely. Although I'll temper that by saying I was given, as a form of gratitude, some durian sweets from a very lovely Malaysian student. And I've never tasted durian before, and I did not feel elated after I tasted it. It was really horrible. But we'll move on from that. You want to respect a student if they respect you. You want to rise and support the students that give. So generally, a good day is described as ending with a feeling for the tutor of being stretched, tired, fulfilled, and having made a difference for the better, which is a pretty good way to end a day, I think. But it's not always the way the day ends. Sometimes it doesn't work like this. Is there any? I've just seen Mandy's message. Is there anybody else who is having trouble with sound? Is it me? Is it the connection? Can you all hear me all right? Okay. A couple of people are saying they're all right. Okay. I'm sorry, Mandy. It is you. I hope you're catching most of it. It is being recorded though, don't forget. All right, so not liking. What do we not like? What do we not like? Sometimes it just doesn't work. What's going on there? Hochschild believes that emotion locates the position of the viewer. By that she means we reflect on feeling. When we reflect on feeling, we reflect on our own perspective, the sense of from where I am. So if from where you are sitting, your student appears rude, then it can lead to a sense of deflation. And if the student appears to lack motivation or interest or effort, then you might get angry, you might become impatient, you might just disengage and think, well, what's the point? If students come in and they're very demanding, then it might make you very task oriented and you want to just deal with them and get rid of them. Students can be manipulative. I've had one like that recently, and it does irritate me because I can see that she's trying to play me against my colleague. That's very irritating. Sometimes students are just passive and they don't want to engage, and it might make you think, well, why should I as well then? Why should I? And helplessness. Some people don't like helplessness, and when they are confronted with helpless students, they can be dismissive and not want to deal with it. And we can use these feelings to give a clue to the operating truth, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. And I just want to make it clear that there's no judgment here at all. It's just noticing and seeing what's going on and how it's working. What's the complicating factor? One complicating factor is that there is a gap between feeling and its interpretation. So we can disguise what we feel or pretend to feel what we do not, which is surface acting. This is where you put a smile on your face, and it doesn't matter what kind of a day you're having, that student is going to get a friendly smile. You can also completely dissolve the gap between the stimulus and the response, and then we're deceiving ourselves as much as other people, and you don't have to pretend anymore. Maybe that's okay, maybe it's got some issues. I think we might touch on that later. Okay, I can see there's all sorts of really interesting comments coming up here, and I'm really enjoying seeing all your thoughts. Student stress is difficult. They try and put your stress on you, and it's not your stress, but they're trying to give it to you, and you have to manage that. It's hard. You have to put that buffer up, and it takes energy to do that. I completely agree. And I taught a class yesterday, Rowena, where I absolutely appeared to care more about their learning than they did. And what can you do but plough on? or, drink, but we won't go there. All right, so I mentioned operating truths just now, and these basically clarify the feeling rules involved in being a learning developer or a learning tutor or somebody who works to support students. Um, so feeling rules are the standards used in emotional conversation to determine what's rightly owed and owing in an exchange, and Hochschild calls this gift exchange, a form of gift exchange, because either feeling something or withholding a feeling becomes a contribution to the group because it will be presumably maintaining some sort of stability and harmony. So, for example, you might not get on with your mother-in-law, but it's your father-in-law's birthday. So, for the sake of family harmony, you both pretend to be perfectly um, conciliatory towards each other. That's just a completely random example. Or maybe if you give somebody a present, then they owe you. They owe you a feeling of, well, they don't owe you a feeling of gratitude. They owe you the expression of gratitude. They might not like the present, but within a stable, harmonious social group, they owe you the expression of gratitude. So that's an operating truth. That's a feeling rule. So when things are working well, come on, little button. There we go. If the student provides a contribution of some sort, um, then there is reciprocal energy on the part of the tutor. If the tutor senses any form of engagement, and sometimes, let's face it, we're looking for anything, they will respond, and not necessarily equally, sometimes even more so. Contribution from the student is rewarded with great energy. However, if the student lacks something, maybe they lack attention or civility or motivation, then the tutor will correspondingly withdraw something, maybe their good humour or their patience or their effort. And where there is inequality, well, going back to the flight attendants, if there is this inequality between them, between the flight attendant and the passenger, it's predicated on the fact that the passenger can choose not to smile, but the flight attendant is obliged to. Now, we haven't reached this stage yet in higher education. I hope we don't, because withdrawal was absolutely common to all respondents, and therefore it must be probably a very valuable function of working with students. We have the right, if we sense a lack, with withdrawing. But we do resent the students. That comes up a lot. We resent the students for withholding their part of the transaction. They are not following through on what they're supposed to be doing, because nearly every response I received mentioned the single word frustration. It popped up all over the place. And I think this is because of, by the nature of our job, we tend to build relationships with students. It's very much interpersonal, isn't it? So our interactions are not transactional, and we don't see teaching as part of a customer service culture, whatever the powers that be might try to invoke. One of the questions that I asked was about how far do you identify as a tutor? And the way that we work with students and our feelings about work with students might be related to this. Just under half of everybody that responded, so I had 24 and I think it was 11, it was literally just under half, considered it to be a natural role for them. It really fitted their personality, and it was very important to them in vocational terms, and also due to the values that they held and that were associated with the job. Of the remainder, so that would be about 13 people, around about half, 7 or 8, yes, sorry, 6 or 7, maths. They were happy to do it. They felt a connection to it, and that was fine, but it certainly wasn't an integral part of their identity. And the remainder saw it as just a job, and they had emotional distance from it, very clear emotional distance. There weren't any clear patterns here, really, aside from that, in terms of informing those answers. which was a shame, but life isn't neat, so that doesn't matter. But I do think it might be a function of the tutor's team. So if the tutor had a team that was close and supportive, the more likely the tutor was to say they identified strongly with the role. The people who said they didn't identify it at all, um, generally, with one exception, didn't have a team. They worked all by themselves. And those people with a strong sense of identity also had a supportive manager. They felt appreciated and supported by their colleagues. They had that good team around them, and they also had positive feedback from the students. Students appreciated them. So it's probably more a factor of social reinforcement, and that suggests to me to be a completely different issue, which I think would be really useful to pursue, but maybe not by me. What I did find interesting, I wanted to know what people would say they were like at work compared to what they were like at home. And the person at work is not necessarily, however strongly they identify as a tutor, they're not necessarily the same as the person at home. Many people describe themselves as nicer at work, which I thought was quite funny. And again, if I'm honest, I can agree with that. I think it's because the feelings that you can show at work are delimited and constrained by emotion management. You can't be ranting and raving through your foyer, can you? If you get annoyed about something, you're not gonna you're not gonna last very long without being called into your manager's office. So at work, a lot of people describe themselves as being more upbeat and controlled and patient. Um, but the flip side of that, they also said they felt less relaxed and subjective. Um, and they're doing emotional labour because at home, clearly, they're more relaxed and they're being free to feel however they might want to feel. Um, and they're noticing the gap between feeling and behaviour. All right. Right. The last question was around authenticity. And this was open. I just wanted to ask them what did they feel it meant to be authentic in their role, however they might have described their role. And out of all the responses that I got back, they could all be grouped under three main headings: how people chose to see authenticity. Um, and some of them saw authenticity in terms of themselves, the individual. Some of them saw it in terms of how they work with students, and some of them saw it in terms of their general practice. Um, and these were their definitions. And they all have in common the ideas of giving and of being real in whatever sense, and of forming genuine relationships. So, in short, to be authentic as a teacher, therefore, must involve a lot of emotion work and of the variety that requires no pretense but instead true belief, because, of course, otherwise you would not be authentic. All right, I've got a couple more slides before I ask you some questions. What does this mean then? So just to summarize what I've been talking about, if you're going to be a good tutor, then generally you need to have energy, a lot of energy, and you need to make personal connection. So it requires the giving of yourself to another person. And you must actively focus on the student and on their needs. Obviously within working hours. I certainly didn't see anybody suggesting that a good tutor requires you to drop everything and respond any time of the day or night. But while you're with a student, then you're completely actively focused on them and doing whatever you can do to help them. Makes me really tired just reading all of this stuff. So what's the outcome? Well, there are some problems with this. I mean, it's interesting, sure, but there are implications that aren't necessarily positive. And this again comes from Hochschild. She's identified these three possible outcomes from her work with flight attendants. Um, the latter two of these are distinguished by how the attendant feels about having that separation. Um, are you blaming yourself for it? Are you feeling guilty about it, or are you not? The first stance, I think, is, I don't know, is it the most damaging? It depends on your perspective, really, but it can be very damaging. If we relate it to tutors, then it basically involves a lack of depersonalization. You're carrying the role too close. Um, the tutor cannot address the students or their work objectively. It's become too tightly bound with that personal, um, emotional work. Um, it can be stressful. It certainly takes a lot of your energy, and eventually, such a tutor may just detach completely and stop caring altogether, which would be terrible. The second stance is a fairly healthy estrangement, I think. Um, you're not vulnerable to burnout. You can see that you're just doing a job and it's okay, and when you're doing it, you do it as well as you can. But you might feel phony at times. Hochschild talks a lot about phoniness, um, and you might feel guilty about that. You might feel bad that you're not being your true self with the students, or you might not. I mean, it depends on you. It depends on the individual. Um, in the third stance, the tutor is barely emotionally present at all. They're there, they're just functioning, doing a job, and they might be perceived as doing the job poorly by students. Um, I mean, I'm certainly not suggesting any of my respondents are doing the job badly, simply that the effort of emotion work can be damaging, it can exact a toll if it's not managed properly. The real issue is how a tutor can adjust themselves to the role um, with regard to the control they have over the conditions they work in. Um, almost everyone said they didn't have enough time to do the job. If I said, what do you need to do your job well? They all said time. They want time. They can't do it as well as they want to. And again, this kind of pressure, especially if you've got to speed up your service, if you've got to see more students in less time, if you've got to deal with things more quickly and you don't have the luxury of being able to go into depth, that can also detach the tutor emotionally from the role, or it might exacerbate any feelings of pretense and could be a source of stress. Basically, we are an emotional species. The answer is not to feel emotion, because emotion is useful. Emotion is helping us do our jobs well. It can make us better at what we do. And the question is, how do we manage this so it stays beneficial rather than harmful? How do we keep that balance right? And how much emotion are we willing to give away and feel for higher education? Yeah, lots to think about. It's really interesting stuff, and I've kept half an eye on some of the comments that have popped up. Suggestion of counselling or debriefing. I think it's really useful, which might be why having a supportive team is so valuable. It helps the tutor get that element out in a safe space, so they can shed that emotion and reset themselves, maybe. Um, yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, not all team leaders are seem to be very good at doing that, um, as far as I could tell. Um, somebody also said somebody further up, Victoria. It's not written up yet, but it's going to be. It's my goal for this year. It will be written up and published this year. Um, so let's move on. I've got some discussion points. I thought that would be really interesting because I can see here that there's people from various points. Thank you very much, Antipodeans, for getting up. I think that's amazing. Um, so here's a few questions. I'll put them all up because we don't need to deal with them one by one. I was wondering about where you are, whether you're from the UK or Canada, New Zealand, or Australia, or even just in a particular type of higher education institution. What kind of emotional labour do you come across? What do you feel obliged to perform? Does anybody else have such an emphasis on customer service, for example? Um, I've presented to you some suggestions of what it means to be authentic. Just flicking back, I can go back there. But what does it mean to you? Um, how important is it to be real? Is it is it just a job? How far do you identify? Um, Emotional burnout. How much of a risk is it? Am I overstating a point here? Is it actually not too much of a problem? Is there anything that we as a profession can do to help that be managed a bit more? And finally, and I'm not suggesting that we need to sit here until we've dealt with all of these, they're just ideas. But given what I've been talking about with customer service, um, and particularly in the UK with the rise of tuition fees, um, certainly there's a high consumer culture. What further impact might there be on that? What happens to emotions in that kind of framework? So, any ideas, anybody? Lots. Okay, so Lee feels it's a lifestyle. That's interesting. Yeah, there were a couple of other people that lived the job and they didn't see it as a separation. So yeah, I was pleased to see somebody else has agreed with that. And I'm just reading Rowena's comment here about the role and the position of our jobs in institutions. That's very resonant with what John was talking about, and the question of where do you sit in an institution? Are you that tiny satellite orbiting the dead planet? Are you an academic? Are you respected by academic colleagues? So there's obviously a lot of emotional labour going into that. That's very tiring. It takes a lot of energy when you've got to manage colleagues' feelings of uncertainty, when you've got to manage your own worries about job insecurity. Yeah, okay. Very different. Very different. Carrying out research and studying as well. Yeah, so really trying to keep up more than one area. Um, I work for a university that is pretty good at what it does. We don't generally do particularly well in the league tables, but we do all right with what we're doing. But we've decided now that we really need to be excellent at research. We do not have any kind of history of research. We don't have that kind of culture, but now there's a big drive towards research, and there's a lot of pressure on people now to start doing research and produce papers. And that does increase pressures. You've got other things on your mind. Maybe there's less space that you can give to your job. Yeah. Oh, cultural aspect. Thank you, Suzanne. Yes. So we've got in NZ dealing with students of different cultures to the tutor's culture. Yes, yeah, I think that's a really good point actually, and I didn't address that in my research. Um, we have a high proportion of Nigerian students at Solent, and also what's our biggest? Our biggest international groups are Nigeria, China, Saudi Arabia, and Norway. Funnily enough, um, and it's learning how you best. It's not just doing the job, but it's also making that personal connection and attempting to meet with that student on a level that might be different to the student that you've just seen or the student that you'll see next. It's trying to um, form that knowledge, understand something about where they're coming from. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you very much for bringing that up. Um, Eleanor, I think you're right as well. Working with individuals, I'm in my office at the moment, and sometimes, some parts of the day, there'll be a student sat next to me for most of the day, and I'll be going through, talking to them, going through their work, having a chat with them. And then other parts of the week, I might be in front of a class, trying to teach them some aspect. And there is a very different feel to it. It's easier to make that connection face to face, I think, but possibly also it takes a lot more energy on that one to one. It's more intense, perhaps, so it is different. Yeah. Oh, I'm missing lots. This is really good. Yeah, so Sandra, you're saying that one-to-one work is draining and demanding. Um, and sometimes that isn't it's not valued by the institution. You're seen as expensive. Why can't you deal with lots of people all in one go? Why don't you just put something online and you can deal with that? And so you're not just dealing with the emotional labour of the work that you're doing with the students, but you've got to deal with the emotional labour of feeling all right about that work and still feeling it's still valuable and worthwhile when your managers or your institution is sending you either implicit or explicit messages that this is not how they want to spend their money. Yeah. What else do we have? Joanna, yes, that's you've hit something there. I think that is one of the things I find the most draining about group work is when you have to feel that you need to justify why you're there and why it's useful. Um, when students come to see you on a one-to-one, they understand that you're useful. But when you turn up in their class talking about whatever you might be talking about, critical thinking, for example, then you need to sell it to the students. It's not just a question of teaching them, you've got to sell it to them as well. And that is very draining. Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a lot of intercultural issues coming up here. Yeah. That's a really good point, Lee, as well. Thank you. Thinking about our biography, who are we as well? What kind of experiences have we had? Um, I've found it, in many ways, I found it quite easy working my way through Solent and gaining acceptance in what I do at Solent simply because I have a PhD. And not many people at my university have PhDs. Never mind that mine is in archaeology and absolutely nothing to do with learning development. But the fact that I can put doctor in front of my name has taken me quite a long way. Whereas for somebody who doesn't have that, um, they're just fighting against the tide along with everybody else. Um, what I'm suspecting from what I can see here is that I might send the questionnaire out again, and perhaps I will send it internationally, um, because I think there's some really interesting intercultural, international issues coming up here. But there's also a lot of commonality from what I can see. Um, Feeling constrained by the model that you're working within, um, feeling constrained by perceptions of who you are and what you're doing, feeling constrained by what you're able to do with the resources that you have. Yeah, it's very difficult. And then, of course, yeah, it's a good point about competition there. It's not just customer service once they're in here, but we've got to get them in here as well, and we've got to sell that to them. We've got to be a product that the student can use and make use of. And it's not a nice way to think of yourself, I don't think. Um, yeah, yeah, the emphasis has definitely shifted away from employees. Mm. That's a really good point as well, Rowena, about the just-in-time approach. It becomes a bit of a fix-it, doesn't it? It becomes a bit of a hey, if you need to know how to write academically, then just look at this and you'll be fine. And oh, you're doing an essay now. Let's get a learning developer to talk to you about essay writing. Um, and it does have that remedial feel to it. There's not the time, there's not the space to spend working on that development as much as we would like. Um, and I think that is really difficult. Oh, okay. Yes, lots of people want to answer my questionnaire. That's rather good. I will. I will send it out again because then I get to fill in my grid again, and that caused me a lot of happiness. Simple pleasures. And as somebody, we were talking about research and the trials of having a feet in both camps, but I do remember thinking I would put aside an hour in my day and I'd say, right, this is the day when I'm going to be analysing some questionnaires. And it was really, really very nice. It was just a little breather and being able to think about something else. Um, there's an interesting point about the NSS here. This is the National Student Survey in the UK, which started off as a general satisfaction questionnaire, and it now basically controls government policy and budgets. It's fairly ridiculous, and it does drive management decisions, and we're a part of that now. Retaining students, keeping them in their place, keeping them going, getting them a pass, and making them fill in a questionnaire at the end of it that implies that we're all very happy. Um, it's surely not sustainable as a model, surely not sustainable. Yeah, it's very difficult. Um, see, we've got a few minutes left, and you're still going brilliantly. It's great. Um, so thank you all for your comments. This is wonderful. Oh, now, Suzanne, that's a really interesting comment. Does it make a difference how we get into the role? Um, did you choose the role, or is it a default role? And I have to confess, although I think I've redeemed myself now, I got into learning development because I finished my PhD and realised that if I wanted a job in archaeology, I'd have to wait for someone to die. And I saw this a post advertised, and I thought I could do that. But then I did actually choose to stay in the field, so I think I have redeemed myself. But that's a really important point. And I think a lot of well, I know a lot of what Aldine is trying to do with the professional development working group is to develop it as a profession, thinking about preparing and supporting somebody in the role. But within different institutions, you could easily just be someone that's brought in because our students can't reference. We need someone to help them with that. We need somebody to help this, that, and the other. So you can do that. And if you are piloted, just kind of dumped into that situation, and you're managing it as best you can, and you don't have that experience, um, yeah, what's that going to mean for how you cope with that emotionally? Probably the people who, well, I don't know. I think it's going to have to be in a question on the questionnaire. I have to add it, but it will be something um, like if you've had lots of training, if you've had lots of experience, you're going to be more able, perhaps, to say, okay, it's going to be fine. There's no need to worry. There's no need to get too involved. I've had a lot of experience of this. I could be completely wrong about that. Um, but I think that's a really important point. How do you get into learning development? Yeah. And the idea of your cost effectiveness and your value added as well. How many people have you seen? How many students have you reached? I've individually reached probably about 1,000 students this academic year, but It's not enough. For some people, they're like, oh, that's amazing, and for some people in management, they're saying, well, what's the point of that when we've got 11,000 students? There's a lot of pressure there. Yes. Well, this is clearly an issue that has touched a nerve somewhat. It's clearly something that people feel strongly about. It's clearly something that is relevant to a lot of people.